contrast what I've been saying about China with the United States and the situation in the United States. How to describe this? Well, clearly America is losing influence. I mean, this bar chart here, the red lines are China and the grey lines are the United States over a 10-year period. And you can see that 75% of the Chinese think that they now exercise more influence globally than they did 10 years ago. Only 21% of Americans think that. And then go to the right-hand side, 48% of Americans think that the influence of their country has declined over the last 10 years, and only 10% of Chinese think the same. Now, the key word here, to understand what's happening to the United States, is decline. The United States is in decline. Now, when I argued this in the book, many people, including in China, I think, didn't agree with me. They thought I was exaggerating the difficulties the United States was facing. Now, it's absolutely clear that the United States is in decline. It may not be able to accept that fact. I mean, Obama, for example, categorically said, those who argue that America is in decline are completely wrong. This country is not in decline. But it is in decline. Whichever measure you can see it in terms of international influence, in terms of its relative economic position, the United States is in decline. And it is exhibiting some of the symptoms of this problem. I mean, two symptoms of this phenomenon are, first of all, America is becoming more and more polarized and more divided in a way which is making governance increasingly difficult and on a lot of issues actually impossible. And the other symptom of this is turning inwards. You know, when countries go into decline, they withdraw, they retreat. They say, we were great, we need to once more reproduce the conditions which made us great in the first place. And so, far from reaching out, they look inwards. For example, to take the question of Trump, I mean, essentially, Trump's positions twofold. First of all, a rejection of some of the key tenets of post-1945 American foreign policy, and secondly, a rejection of post-1980s globalization project, which initially, at least, the Americans were the pioneers of. You can see in Trump's approach a sort of growing, not just a retreat, but a growing isolationism, which of course, if you go back 100 years or so, was the philosophy prior to the First World War of American foreign policy. In other words, a retreat into what we were rather than what we need to be in terms of the future. Or take another example, which is that clearly Trump is a white supremacist. That he believes that essentially America, which as you know is a very multiracial country, the core of that country and the leadership of that country and the privilege of that country is essentially for white people and not for people of other races. And thirdly, his view of the world is not to embrace the diversity of a multipolar world, but it is to assert the power and the strength of America as the world's most powerful nation state. Now, very interestingly, I think probably we could say that Trump is the first major American politician to recognize the phenomenon of American decline. But he believes he can reverse it. He believes that he can make America great again, to use his own words. He won't. He will not succeed. He will certainly, in my view, fail.
OK， 那么接下来因为您刚才提到了特朗普一定会他虽然提出了口号是使美国重新走向伟大，但是他一定会遭遇失败。那么为什么您认为美国的衰落是不可逆转的，是一个也就是说它是一个长期的趋势呢？
You know, I think that one of the great compelling stories of the 21st century is going to be the decline of the United States. And when countries go into decline, relative decline, not absolute decline, always talking about relative decline, well, usually, normally relative decline. When countries go into relative decline, it's a process that is extremely difficult to reverse. You see, countries that have been, as it were, great, when they go into decline, cannot believe it. I'm not just talking about the governments and the elites and so on. I'm talking about the ordinary folk, the ordinary people. Our country is great. We are the best in the world, or one of the best in the world. And very few politicians even have the courage to say that our country is in decline. Why? Because people do not want to hear that message. They don't believe it could possibly be true. We are, after all, great. What happens? What's the syndrome of decline? The syndrome of decline is it's not really happening. It can't be true. Now, if you think it can't be true, then you constantly try and hold on to what you've got, what you are, what you were. You don't think forwards, you don't think strategically. You're constantly on the defensive, trying to retain what you've got, what you've managed to achieve over the years, over the decades. You know, I am an expert on this question because I come from Britain. And Britain has specialised in decline. In fact, it's got a PhD in decline ever since 1945, or actually British decline starts before the First World War. And shall I tell you something? Even now we don't believe we're in decline. Even now we think we're a great country. We had an empire that commanded 1/5 of the world's landmass and 1/5 of the world's population. So we don't need Europe because we're great. Everyone wants to trade with us. Huh. You know, I am very pessimistic about the future for the United States, actually. I think that it's going to be extremely difficult for the Americans even to accept the idea. And the reason I think this is because let's remember what the history of the United States is. It was created on the basis of the destruction, virtual extermination of the indigenous population, the Amerindians. It was created by European migrants coming from the continent of Europe to create a new land. So it didn't actually, before the arrival of the Pilgrim Fathers, have a memory, an experience, a hinterland, a history to draw upon. America remains, in historical terms, a very new country. So ever since its as it were, moment of creation, its birth in this modern form, America has been on the rise. It doesn't know what adversity is in broad historical terms because it's not experienced it. Of course, it's had recessions and the big crash in the 1930s and so on. But America, as a global power, as a global phenomenon, has always been on the rise. I think America is going to find... I don't think America, in these conditions, with this kind of challenge, is going to be very resilient. I think it could turn out to be quite fragile and brittle. You know, one of the interesting things is always in a country when things start going wrong, you get polarization, you get division, and you get fragmentation. And it's no accident that you can see in America now the divisions of the Civil War of the 1860s, the use of the Confederate flag, the Confederate statues and so on, once more raising the old racial divisions of the United States. And I'll be absolutely honest with you, I think in the long run there is a serious danger for America of fragmentation. I mean, just as an example to conclude this, and that is my own country, Britain, and the consequences of decline. In 1945, Britain was part of an empire. As I said earlier, a fifth of the world's population was part of the British Empire. Then, progressively during the late 40s, 1950s, and especially 1960s then, it lost its empire. So Britain became England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Now you can see the rise of Scottish nationalism. A couple of years ago, pretty close referendum vote, 55-45. The 45% of the Scottish people wanted to leave the UK. I think there's a pretty strong chance that at some point the Scots will leave the UK. I'm not saying they will, but I think there's a pretty strong chance. That would leave us England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland is for certain at some point going to leave the UK because Northern Ireland is going to join with the Irish Republic to create, for the first time historically, for a long, long time, a united Ireland. And poor old Great Britain will just be England and Wales. I think the point is, you know, that when countries go into decline, there's an assumption on those countries that it's only a temporary phenomenon. Why? Is that historical experience? I suggest that frequently decline is permanent. Look what happened to Greece. Look what happened to the Roman Empire, which was extremely large. The only country I can think of immediately that managed to reverse the process was China. But, you know, China, you had to go through some terrible experiences to get to where you are now.
那么您认为中国为什么像您刚才所说，美国也衰落了，那么中国它逆袭，它崛起了？您认为中国崛起是基于怎么样一个深层次的原因，可以使过去遭遇了百年耻辱的中国没有走向分崩离析，反而是崛起成为今天我们所看到的中国？其中最深层次的原因是什么？
You know, I think what we need to do now is to think again about the reasons for China's rise. You know, we've had lots of propositions made, but can I suggest that the propositions, the explanations we have are too cast in the present, too contingent. and that as we watch China transforming itself, I think we've got to dig much deeper to try and understand the real factors behind the rise of China. Well, the first reason I want to offer you is demography, is the population size of China. Now, in the 19th century, during the rise of Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and so on, the conventional wisdom of the time was that small, relatively small, nimble European nation states are easier to govern, more innovative, and, as it were, more mobile than the great demographic states, for example, Asia, for example, China and India. In other words, it's an advantage to have a small population rather than a very large population. Now let's look at the situation in the 21st century. And the picture looks the opposite. The largest economy in the world soon, by both measures, will be China. And further down the road, India will become the second largest. And the third largest will be the United States. And those smaller European nation states don't look so smart in the 21st century. In other words, in the historical circumstances of the 19th century, at that level of technology, in that era of geopolitics, it was an advantage to be a relatively small country. But in the 21st century, it looks very different. Why does it look very different? Well, there's probably a range of explanations, but one of them is certainly about globalization. That in the era of globalization, size of population has become what looks like a serious advantage. The second factor, so the first factor is demography. The second factor is longevity. Now, you may remember I've just been talking about the United States and saying the fact that the United States is a relatively modern creation is a disadvantage. It can be an advantage for a period, but it then becomes a disadvantage. Now, China, I think China's longevity, however you measure, this is a very crude map here, but this is 2011 BC, the Han Dynasty, which occupied sort of half the size of China today on the east and central side of China, is still 2,000 years old. And I think that what longevity offers is resilience. It offers a reservoir of historical experiences, some good, some bad. If they're bad, as long as you learn from them, they can also be good. And I think that this, China is a treasure trove of historical experience. And China, more than any other country in the world, is more familiar, more engaged with its history, more aware of its history, more aware of the classical scholars and what they said than any other country in the world. And I think this provides China with a really powerful resource. And in many ways a deep sense of confidence, not an arrogant confidence, but a confidence in the historical achievement of China. By the way, don't get too hung up about these maps. The Han Dynasty, they're very, very crude maps. The Han Dynasty lasts for 400 years. And it expanded a lot during that period. And by the way, you can't really treat the yellow as solid yellow, because there were bits of China that I've included there which were not part of it. So just treat it as an idea rather than a cartographic accuracy. The third factor is inclusivity. In other words, I'm trying to give you here, just to remind you where we got to, the deeper explanations for China's success in this era, and I think into the future as well. First one is demography, the second one is longevity, and the third is inclusivity. Now look, China is an extremely difficult country to govern. Why? Because it's huge. Because it's got 1.4 billion people, or at any time in history it had, relatively speaking for its times, a very large population. What do large populations mean? Powerful centrifugal forces creating potential fragmentation, held together, one hopes, by stronger centripetal forces. But the reality is that China's always been an extremely difficult country to govern. All Chinese leaderships down the ages to the present time, in some degree or other, have been suffering from a degree of paranoia. And this, I think, historically has had a certain advantage, and that is both in the imperial period, Confucian imperial period, and in the communist period. Chinese leaders have been concerned about how you hold the country together, about how you create an inclusivity and a balance in the country. And this was true of, of the dynasties, not just in the present period. This is part of Confucian teaching as well. So inclusivity, the recognition of inclusivity, of balanced development, is very central to beliefs regarding Chinese governance. The rise of populism and the Trump phenomenon and Brexit were probably most importantly a consequence of what I would call hyper-globalization or uber-globalization. Globalization for the winners, and it doesn't matter about those who've been left behind. I mean, if China had behaved like the American and British governments did between 1980 and 2010, then China would be suffering some serious social instability, in my view. And I think this partly explains the Chinese government's tremendous investment in fighting poverty, even now to the 20 million people which is now essentially the campaign, that still remain very poor in China. And I think that the Chinese leadership will find itself increasingly incumbent upon them to deal with the growing problem of inequality in China, and I think they will. I was at a meeting with Wang Qishan, and I was very interested that he was arguing, this was 2 years ago, that the present corruption must be addressed because it is dangerous for governance in China, a growing lack of faith in the party and government. But after that, we must address the problem of inequality. I think that's right. But the important point here is that China, as a huge country, has a notion and a recognition and an understanding about the importance of inclusivity and balanced development, which stands in stark contrast to the recent experience in the West. And my fourth and final point about the deeper reasons for China's success in this period brings together the demographic point I made at the beginning and the physical size of China as well. You see, China isn't really, let's face it, a nation state. I mean, you can't compare China with Denmark or Sweden or the UK. I mean, many of these countries are very small, and many countries in the world are very small. China is not in any sense a conventional nation state, even though it has some of the attributes of a nation state. As I argued before, China is primarily a civilization state. China is a continent. Or to use a phrase which belongs to the current global discourse, China is a sub-global system in its own right. 20% of the world's, 19% of the world's population. And I think this offers some insight into how China sees itself and how it sees its relationship with the rest of the world. That we know that outside the nation state, it's very difficult to have governance at higher levels. Global bodies don't work very well. They're captive to dominant interests, which for the last 200 years have been Western interests, and so on. If you like, they are the epitome, the expression of still nation-state dominance. So it's very, very difficult. You look at the European Union and the difficulties the European Union is having. It's very difficult to have forms of global governance. What's the great crisis, in a way, for large parts of the world today? I would suggest to you it is a governance deficit. Okay, the rich world to some extent can take care of itself and has taken care of itself over time, and the nation states kind of work and so on. But there's great areas of the world, North Africa, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, which suffer from an absolutely chronic governance deficit. So there is as China becomes the leading country in the world, it will face these kind of questions and how to deal with them, and how to offer leadership, how to offer initiative in relationship to them. And I think China, when it looks at these questions, will find within itself certain historical experiences and insights which will give it a very valuable contribution to trying to solve these kind of problems. I mean, in a way, the Belt and Road Initiative is a microcosm of this, because the Belt and Road Initiative, what is it? Well, in some ways, it's an extrapolation of China's own experience. Why can China speak like this? Because China is a developing country. It's had the experience of the problem, the imperative of development. And what it is offering, in a way, is saying, look, our transformation was achieved by a combination of large-scale investment, above all in infrastructure, high levels of economic growth, with the state playing a crucial role in this process. We are not a model for you. I don't think China should think of itself as a model for you, but we are an experience. We've had an experience. We're an example that you can draw from in the transformation of the Eurasian landmass. Now, we've never, ever, in the modern period of history, had a country that could make this kind of offer, this kind of proposition. And of course, part of this is also, which I'm not going to talk about now, part of this is that China is different because it is not a nation state, singularly. It is a civilization state with all the complexities that a civilization represents in trying to hold together the very disparate elements of a country as large as China.
那么非常非常感谢马林雅克先生刚才所说的中国 崛起，中国获得成功的深层次的原因。那么我们在展望未来的时候，我们应该注意中国未来会面临怎么样的，有哪些风险，有哪些挑战。
As you can hear from what I've been saying, I think China's in a very good place. According to Huangong, Tsinghua figures here, the Chinese economy is likely to represent 34% of global GDP by 2030, which is 13 years, 12 years ahead, just over 12 years ahead. India will be second, the United States will be third, China will be bigger than the United States and Europe put together, plus 8%. So, and I think, I don't know whether these are projections, but might not happen as quickly. I think it will happen. Might not happen as quickly, might happen more quickly. Who knows? I think there are some serious problems. I mean, there's lots of serious problems that China faces. I remember in 2009 when 2010 when I got a lot of talks in China, and people said, no, you're much too confident about China. Actually, they were right, but I was also right. There remain a lot of problems, but of course things have moved on very well. I just want to identify 4 factors to be wary of. Firstly, Trump. I mean, Trump has basically been consistent to his election campaign. A lot of the things he said he was going to do, he's done, or he's in the process of doing, and he certainly hasn't retreated from most of them. The one thing he hasn't really acted on is China. There's been no really strong protectionist measures so far. I'm very glad to say that, but that doesn't make me confident about the future. There's been a political consistency about it, and 2, I think that he is unpredictable, and I think that I would definitely not rule out the development of a trade war between China and the United States, which would have profound, probably reconfiguring effects on the global economy and the geopolitical situation. So I'm not saying that this will happen, but I'm certainly not going to rule it out. I think that is a danger. And the other thing I'd say about Trump is we've not had an American president that has been so gung-ho about the possibility of using nuclear weapons since the darkest days of the Cold War. The speech he gave at the UN when he said something like, "We will totally destroy North Korea," was the threat of using nuclear weapons. And I'll be quite frank with you, this is the first time since I was a kid that I've thought nuclear war is not to be ruled out. The other thing I'd make point about America and China is that America is not just Trump. The problem isn't just Trump. Trump is a particular political expression. But basically America has become more and more anti-China. And the reason it's become more and more anti-China, the centre of gravity has shifted in a way almost to the point where the whole era since the Nixon-Mao Accord, which is, there's certain lines of continuity take us up to the present, is under threat in a more general way. Why? Because for the first time, Americans actually believe that China is a very, very serious rival to America's position in the world. Hitherto, America could be benign and have a patronising view of China and believe that China one day will be like us, it will adopt Western style democracy and all the rest of it. And now they realise that that's increasingly unlikely. So I think that the friction, the conflict between China and the United States is likely to grow. And it'll require great statesmanship and leadership on the part of the Chinese government, which so far I think they've displayed in abundance, to deal with that question. Well, I could say also psychologically, we've never had a pubescent male youth in charge of the United States. Right, inequality. Second point, inequality. I've spoken a bit about this already. Look, China's Gini coefficient is now one of the highest in the world. On a 0 to 1 is the way the Gini coefficient is measured. 0 means you're a completely equal society. 1 means you're a completely unequal society. China's at about 0.45, which is one of, not the worst, but one of the worst in the world. In the Mao period, China was one of the most equal countries in the world. I don't think inequality is the same as poverty. It's a related problem, but it's not the same. Inequality is the disparity of income and wealth across the population. Poverty is an absolute measure of the number of people who are living below a certain line of level of income. I think that there are complex reasons for this. Maybe the most important is geographical, which is the varying positions of different parts of the country in this context. But it's also absolutely evident across cities like Shanghai and Beijing and Guangzhou and lots of cities, Wuhan and so on, lots of cities. And I think that the Gini coefficient is too high in China and it needs to be reduced. And the consequences of not tackling the problem could be very serious for social stability in the longer run, or maybe in the shorter term. The point about this kind of thing is you never know when it's going to strike. I mean, you know, what happened in the United States with Trump and so on was that for 40 years, from 1980 to the present day, roughly half the American population did not experience rising living standards, and the country got more and more and more unequal. And for a long time, nothing happened. And then suddenly, you've seen what happens. So, inequality is something to be taken very seriously. My third point is about confidence, self-confidence, overconfidence. You know, I think that there's still, in an era where China feels much better about itself and is developing new perspectives, there's still much to commend Deng Xiaoping's philosophy, expressed in his 24-character proposition about hide your capability, don't show too much leadership, and so on. You know, China's rising very quickly. There's huge ignorance across the world about China, because for 200 years China was absolutely unknown by and large. There was the Cold War, which instilled a mentality across the world amongst many people of a fear of communism, communist countries, and so on. China's a huge country. I mean, if you ask me what is the biggest problem, single biggest problem that faces China in terms of people's perceptions of China, I think it's probably at the end of the day size. You know, if you're a population of 10 million or 15 million or even 30 or 50 million, and you're looking at a country with 1.4 million people, you know, I mean, it's understandable. I mean, if I'm you know, I'm not very tall myself for a Caucasian, and if I'm facing a guy that's 7 foot high, you know, it's well, when you're younger, certainly you're more careful. And I think that it's just that China always needs to remember that as it becomes so more and more confident, which is fantastic to behold, it doesn't lose sight of seeing the world from the perspective of other countries. Even if you really disagree with them, try and understand what their sensitivities are, what their sensibilities are, what their fears are. Because if you don't, then that will only arouse more resentment. And okay, maybe people can't do much with their resentment, or they may be able to do things with their resentment, but over time it will become a bigger and bigger problem. So I think China needs humility and modesty. Now, actually China's been extremely humble historically. Extremely humble. It was forced to be humble, but it is still today, in my view, the Chinese are very humble about their achievements. And that is a good thing. That is a good thing. And the better China does, the more important it is always to retain. I mean, what don't we like about the Americans? Come on, let's be truthful. We don't like their arrogance. We don't like the way they hector and lecture us. We don't like the way they think that they set the trends, the parameters, the paradigm for the rest of the world. We resent that because we are different. And I think that the Chinese also always need to remember that, even when things are very, very different. And China is indeed the most influential country in the world. And my fourth point and last point is the classic problem that faces countries when they become great powers is that eventually they overreach themselves. They try and take on too much. They try and commit themselves to too many things. And it's a phenomenon which I think, if I remember correctly, Paul Kennedy in his book The Rise and Fall of Great Powers describes as overreach. And this is also a problem that will confront China. Indeed, you could say it confronts China now. Can we afford Belt and Road? Do we have not just the economic resources, but the political, administrative, intellectual resources, diplomatic resources to take on such a huge project? I mean, it's always got to be a calculation. And so I think that China will not be immune to the problem of overreach. Now, I would doubt myself whether, I mean, I think the rise of China will continue, and I think China will be able, I hope and I think and I believe that China will be able to handle these questions. But overreach is always a danger. And I suppose it's worth remembering, let's be finally, my final remark from a philosophical and historical point of view, is that nothing lasts forever in life. As individuals, we don't last forever. And great powers, hegemonic powers, never last forever. This is something the Americans, of course, in their hubris, did not understand, and the British didn't understand. You're not a great power forever. Your hegemony, for all sorts of reasons, at some point, is undermined. And so China's rise, which I, argue very strongly, will happen and will strengthen and will predominate for this century. But it won't last forever. I mean, did the Han, the success of the Han last forever? Did the successes of the Tang dynasty last forever? Did the successes of, well, the more limited, but in some ways more interesting, success of the Song dynasty last forever? Did the early Ming last forever? No. China is exceptional in that it has had several periods, as it were, in the sun. This is remarkable. Probably there's no other country, civilization in the world can say this. But each one eventually comes to an end. and this period also will come to an end. But I personally think that is a very, very long way ahead. Thank you.